right, well, as we get started here, there's some handouts going around. There's also copies of the handouts for Lesson 1 that are in the back. I meant to have those, I just forgot to make copies last time. So Kristen was helpful, reminded, got things going this time. So we have handouts for today's lessons, and then copies for Lesson 1 if you would like to have one of those. So we're continuing our study, right? Drawing near to God, a study of Leviticus, which, right off the bat, I think is kind of a bummer for most people, the idea of studying Leviticus. It's weird and strange, and there's things about mold and skin disease and a whole lot of other, different things. But hopefully we'll do it justice, and we'll actually get to expound upon the brilliance of Leviticus and the special, powerful, important role that it plays in the storyline of the Bible. And to set the stage last time, we kind of, of course, started in Genesis and talked about this reoccurring problem, or this reoccurring longing that God be in an intimate connection with humanity, which He created and chose to partner with us in reflecting His image upon this reality. Yet, how evil made a mess of things, and there's a distancing there, and there's this reoccurring theme as well on the importance and necessity of approaching God, of drawing near to God. And how we got to Mount Sinai, where God had, through an anointed one, Moses, a shadow of Jesus, separated or liberated Israel from oppression and slavery and death from Egypt. And they're now to go into the promised land, but before they make this stop in Mount Sinai for about a year, where they're going to get empowered and prepared and trained and equipped to go into the promised land, to then be this gathered people around the exclusiveness of Yahweh. However, there's some issues that go on early there with the golden calf and idolatry and so forth. But part of what God is doing there is entering into a personal, relational covenant with His people. And several elements of that, which included the 613 commandments, right? The law, the 10 commandments plus 603, the priesthood, and also God's presence with the people that was to be seen in the symbolisms of the tabernacle. And how Exodus ends with the tent of meeting, which is by definition the place you meet with God. The tabernacle, tent of meeting, yet Moses can't enter the tent. And that's a weird way to enter Exodus, or to end Exodus. Then, however, Numbers, we're about 40 years later or so, right? I mean, the idea of like we're going to describe the 40 years, But in Numbers chapter 1, it starts with Moses inside the tent of meeting with God. And then the point is, how did that happen? How was Moses, and consequently, he's a representative of the people, allowed to enter the presence of God, where in Exodus, because of a lot of the sins described even in Exodus, idolatry and so forth, they weren't? Well, Leviticus. Whatever is happening in Leviticus has to do with allowing a broken, sinful people contaminated by the mess of humanity to approach a holy God. So that's the that's the overarching theme or context, if you will, of Leviticus. So everything we're going to look through, so we're going to look at these topics within Leviticus, but all from the framework of somehow this particular thing or another, as weird as it might be, is about allowing a broken people to draw near to God. Okay, summary of last class. We good? Also seems like we got less people, so I think it's already wearing on folks. Stick with it, right? The few, the faithful, the proud, the marine. No, I think that's, stick with it, right? We're glad you're here. Maybe because the topic I'm going to stop announcing the topics for next class. Maybe that's the problem. The topic for today is sacrificial rituals, Leviticus 1 through 7. Okay, not to put anybody on the spot, but did you take the time to read Leviticus 1 through 7? Okay, that's why you're here. And the rest of people, they read and decided not to come. So thank you for not doing your homework. Continue not to, and so then you'll return. Leviticus 1 through 7 it's bizarre. It's weird. It's repetitive. It's intense. There's a lot of killing and slaughtering and details of what to cook and what to burn and what to not cook, and blood splattered everywhere. I don't recommend you just like, depending the age of your children, I wouldn't do that as a bedside story. It could cause nightmares. And it's just, right off the bat, it's weird. Right? It sounded cool, like something about drawing near to God. But then there's these rituals, sacrificial rituals. A couple things to comment before we get into some specifics here. First of all is we have to try to not impose upon the text our modern sensibilities. Right? There's probably plenty of things that we do today that 50 years from now, 100 years from now, if we're still around, say, 3,500 years from now, will sound really weird. Right? Really weird. So we need to understand that distance. We're talking about events 3,500 years ago. 3,500 years ago. So there's a cultural setting, and I think God communicates through people in moments of time. Right? It would be super cool, and maybe to me, part of me would be like, but if it's for all of humanity, can't God just communicate in a way that it just makes sense through and through? No. He can't. He could, but we're the issue. Humanity, we don't see things the way we think. Even the concept of individualism and personal rights and like we're free to make our choice. Okay, that's beautifully naive. We are deeply ingrained in our time in history, in our politics, our world, what's happened. Like we're not floating in nothingness, making just cosmic, choices that have no influences from anything else. So God chooses to communicate through people, through moments of time. And now we get to do the homework of seeing what did that mean then so that we can see what does that mean now. Does that make sense? Okay. Plus it was written a different language. I mean, and on and on and on. Okay. All right. So just a little backstory. This wasn't weird at the time. Okay. The ancient world, the religious setting of the ancient world was one of gods. Everybody and their dog had a god. Okay, the villages had gods, families had gods, nations had gods, and they were often different levels of strength and intensity, and one after the other, and some were petty and some were cruel, and some were just like same human emotions and same human issues and struggles and lust and whatever and corruption, but with powers. Okay? And so that was the reign of the gods. In the ancient world, it was an extremely common practice to offer sacrifice to these gods. Different versions of them, of sacrifices. And they varied in types, different purposes, as we'll also see. And some included even the extreme offering of their children, as we'll also talk about here in a little bit. And these gods of antiquity, they were powerful but often unpredictable. They needed to be appeased. You're trying to gain their approval. You're trying to gain their favor and hoping that your God is better than the God of the people next door. And so the whole offering things to the gods was quite common. In that backstory and in that world, we have Leviticus 18, chapter 18, verse 1 through 4. The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, I am the Lord your God." Right, so that exclusivity. Apparently, my entire sermon Sunday night, I kept saying hallowed wrong. Many of you all noticed. Some of you were kind enough to not point that out to me afterwards. Some of you couldn't wait for the sermon to end, including my daughter. I'm down here shaking hands. I look, and she's just standing there like smiling. I'm like, what did I say wrong? But English is not my first language, so that's fine. So Yahweh, Lord God, exclusive. And he says, you must not do, because Yahweh is exclusively your God. Verse 3, you must not do as they do in Egypt, where they just came out of. You lived there for just 400 years, right? So deeply influenced by them. And you must not do as they do in the land of Canaan, where I am taking you. So there already is a worldview going on in the ancient world, but they are supposed to be uniquely different. Okay? Not that they're not supposed to approach God in some sacrificial ways, but there's something to be different of that from the way Egypt did and where they're supposed to go. Do not follow their practices. Verse 4, you must obey my laws and be careful to follow my decrees. And once again, what's the reasoning? I am Yahweh your God. I am Lord your God. So don't follow other gods. Don't follow other practices. So the sacrificial system described in God's covenant, there's some overlaps. There are sacrificial systems, sacrificial rituals. That's an overlap with the other worlds, or the ancient world. But through God's covenant, it's a means of grace, by which one, even if they sinned, or as a community of people who sinned, without doubt, consistently so, could still approach God without the cost of their life or the cost of the lives of their loved ones. The system was an outward expression, either of a person or of a community, inward's desire to restore the broken relationship with God and with each other. As bizarre as the rituals are, that's their purpose. It's an expression of God's grace, like God is giving them a gift of a means to approach him. And two, it's at its core about restoring broken relationships. Do we have rituals to do that today? If you have a strained relationship, how do we fix that? Right? Think about it. Some of the cliches, like if you got something with your spouse, they can bring her flowers, we have ways. We have legal ways. We have faith-based ways, right? Forgiveness and approach the person. And then if they don't forgive you, you take another person. We have rituals to mend broken relationships. And this is the core of what they're doing. All right. So in chapters 1 through 7, there's 5 different, with some nuances, most of them, but 5 different ritual sacrifices. 2 of them were overall about thanksgiving, and 3 of them were mostly about the idea of reconciliation. All of it has to do with relationships, but 2 of them mostly about thanksgiving, and 3 of them about reconciliation. The Hebrew, we're going to learn some Hebrew here. The Hebrew word for reconciliation is kippur, not kipper, kippur, okay? And it literally means cover over. If Tim and I went to lunch, and we had a nice steak dinner, very big 12-ounce steak and potatoes, like all the fixings. And then I went to pay for my part of it, and I realized I accidentally forgot my wallet back at home. Again, my brother and I have done that with my parents many times. We forget. That's immediately after he and I, my brother and I, fight to take the bill. I got this. No, let me pay. No, I got this. And then eventually one of us will take the bill and be like, oh, man, I forgot my wallet. You should try that with your parents. If Tim was the great friend I hope he is, he would be like, I will kippare for you. And what it means is I will cover what you owe. Right? So that's the essence of kippare. Okay, so let's walk through some of these. 5 of them, right? First one is burnt offering. Burnt offering. Guess what they did there? They burnt stuff. Yeah, that's right. Like, big fires, big cookout. First of all, I want you to think of a lot of this, the ones that involved animals, like going to quote-unquote church, right, at the temple, sacrifices, you're there and you have the altar. I want you to imagine a combination of experiences. Have you ever been to one of those old-timey butcher shops? Have you field dressed an animal, like, deer or whatever? Okay, that's kind of the scene. We got things hanging, stuff being split apart, blood everywhere, knives, and plus all the priests are wearing white, of course, right? They're wearing white, not for long, but they start out wearing white. And so you got all that scene going on. So then you got that, and then imagine like a petting zoo. A lot of animals everywhere, and so then you got that. Then you got a religious setting. So think of like a church gathering, and some prayers and different things, and then some other scary stuff going on, like you're field dressing animals and a bunch of things. So the burnt offering. Here's the practice. We're going to divide each one of these in practice and purpose. And I won't read in great details the practice because none of us are trying to repeat that so much. So, but the general concept. So if you want to read about the burnt offering, it's mostly in Leviticus 1, 3 through 17. The offering could be a bull, a sheep, a goat, a dove, or a pigeon. Dove and a pigeon were for the poor people. So nobody was excluded. Even the poorest could participate in this. The animal was to burnt whole. I don't mean like you overburnt your steak. I mean like you put the whole cow in there and just crisp it down to nothing. Except they could skin it first, and then the priest could keep the skin. I don't know what to make a hat or whatever. But so you're just going to burn it all. Just going to burn it all. Sometimes it takes a long time. Very intense fire. You got to burn it all. The primary contrast between this approach of burnt offering and the way other nations did burnt offerings, for example, the Canaanites, is the Canaanites would burn their children. Think about that. They would burn their children to one god in particular called Molech. And you can actually get online and Google Molech, and you can see some imageries of what they thought maybe the way they built those altars and so forth, and they'd burn their children. Sadly, however, this even will happen in Israel. Remember about that in Judges 11. So apparently they didn't listen when God clearly said, don't you dare be like them. They even got that far away from what God intended. And God was very, 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 very specific about this. Even in Deuteronomy 12, and there's Jeremiah chapter 7. We're just going to read Deuteronomy 12. Deuteronomy 12, starting verse 29. The Lord said, the Lord your God will cut off before you those nations about to which you're going to invade. Have you ever wondered, isn't that weird? The promised land has other people there. And God's just going to say, we're going to move in there, we're going to get rid of all of them. We're just going to move them out, kill them. That's intense. You want to know one reason why? They're the kind of people, it's a version of humanity that got to the point where they normalized and accepted burning their own children. That's got to go. You with me? That version of humanity has got to go. And so this is God explaining it. But when you have driven them out, so you're supposed to, they didn't completely, but when you have driven them out and you settled in the land, and after they have been destroyed before you, be careful not to be ensnared by inquiring about their gods and saying to yourself, how do these nations serve their gods? We will do the same. Oh, we don't struggle with that, do we? Wouldn't it be like the church down the street? Wouldn't it be like the folks, around us, the politics, verse 31, you must not worship the Lord your God in that way, because in worshiping their gods, they do all kinds of detestable things the Lord hates. That's why those folks had to go. They even burned their sons and daughters in the fire as sacrifice to their gods. Verse 32, see that you do all I have commanded you. Do not add to it or take away from it. Which they did. Which they did. So that is part of why, and plus there's a greater imagery going on there. It's like the promised land has a contaminated version of humanity, deeply involved in evil, all the way to doing horrible, detestable things, even killing their own children. And God, through God's presence and representatives, that had to be pushed out. That's the same imagery of God's presence in Genesis 1, and 2. That's the same imagery of the flood. That's the same imagery of here, the promised land, the same imagery of what Jesus came to do, but different layers of how God pushes evil out. And still the same imagery today, when we have the Spirit in us, God is pushing evil out of us. Okay, so that's a continuous theme, just done differently. Yet, God made it crystal clear that they should not offer their children. That's not acceptable and very explicit. Instead, you would offer animals on behalf of what you have done and thus deserve. Which, remember in Genesis 1, Genesis 2, Genesis 3, what's the consequence of a humanity done according to our own definition of right and wrong? Death. Death. That's never changed. That is still the consequence today and has been through the entire story. God in His grace has created rituals or representatives or means that is paid besides us having to die or our children. Okay? And like I said, eventually Jesus. The purpose of this was an offering of reconciliation and an expression of devotion to God. God has allowed me to reconcile with Him through the death of something else, and not my children or others or human sacrifice, something else. And thus I am devoted to this type of God that is a God who accepts other sacrifices on my behalf and not children, not my community, not people. Number 2, grain offerings. Grain offerings. The practice, that's mostly there in Leviticus 2. The instruction for grain offerings can be read through that in chapter 2. It generally was cooked bread, right? You could either bake it, grill it, fry it, roast it, or make it into cereal. It was always seasoned but unsweet. Okay? You could mix it with honey. Seasoned but unsweet, and always unleavened. Unlike the whole burnt offering, you didn't burn all of this. You just burnt portions of it. And the remainder went to the priests. So a bunch of people show up with all these goodies, right, as burnt offerings. Parts of it are burnt in the fire. And then the priests get to keep the rest. The main purpose for this is a couple things. One is recognizing and giving thanks to God's goodness and provision. It's almost like you're thanking God for the harvest kind of concept, which most people in the ancient world had versions of that. We're going to thank the gods for our good fortunes, right? For our blessings, for the harvest, for the rain, for the whatever. And so here it's that continuing thought is thanking God for caring for us, for providing, because where do we get our stuff from? The ancient world thought from the gods. Where do we think? From our sweat, from our brow, from pulling ourselves up, up by our bootstraps. From us. And occasionally when we can't do stuff, we ask God. That's not the ancient world. The ancient world believed all the things one way or inevitably came from the gods. And so it was that recognition of God's goodness and provision, while you're also passing on that goodness and provision to the priests. So it's you thanking God for generosity as you then are being generous to those that make it possible for you and God, because they're intercessors, for you to keep that relationship going. Do we not still do that now? Don't we do that every Sunday when we call like a collection plate and that kind of thing? We're thanking God for his generosity, and we're at least in part using that money to allow others to do that full time. Ministers, missionaries, and so forth. And so it is an expression of thanksgiving for provision, and you then repeating that act of provision to another group, like in this particular case, the priest. So that's the grain offering. Next, fellowship or peace offering. So the practice here, this offering is discussed in Leviticus 3, but then it also goes to Leviticus 7, and it included several different nuances under it. You could do it out of thanksgiving. You could do it a thing called free will. You could do it called the wave offering. And they all have some specifics to it, but we're just going to be broad category here. And the offering could be animal, cattle, sheep, goat. It could be male or female, but it had to be without defect. And if it was specifically about Thanksgiving, you could also include a variety of breads that then, once again, part of it was burned and the rest was given to the priests who were working on your behalf. The purpose of this, and this is cool, we actually do something similar in America, to consecrate a meal between two or more parties before God. So you're not burning it all. You go there, part of it, you field dress the animal, part of it's burned, some of the bread stuff, but then you take some of the rest of that home, because it's just been butchered in nice little pieces. And so you take the rest of that home, and that meal is now a blessed meal that is specifically meant for you to go home and gather family and friends. And it is to be a reminder that you are a fellowship, you are a community. It is to focus on uniting you as a people group. So we get together, it's not just any kind of meal, it's a special meal that we are reminding ourselves that we are connected with God and we are now connected with each other. And it is an expression of commitment to that continuous unity, to peace, and to community. In part, Thanksgiving is somewhat related to that, isn't it? A time for family and friends, and you give thanks. And its original setting, at least as the story goes, right? It was two different people groups finding a way to be united and giving thanks because one helped the other. Well, it's something similar. We actually, part of the Lord's Supper, a lot of this imagery finds itself in the Lord's Supper, because part of what you're to do in the Lord's Supper, according to Paul at least, is for you to remember what God has done through Jesus to make that community, right? The cost of that, which in that particular case isn't a bull being, sacrificed, it's Jesus, the Lamb of God. And then you are to reflect upon your part in the community, right? My part in the community. I think this would be great. I mean, I don't think we need to go kill, animals and specifically for this, but we should keep finding ways today to express our commitment to be invested in each other's lives, to work through whatever things might divide us, whatever things might create conflict within us. And we are committed and we are devoted and we are expressing that community effort. Is the world doing that out there? Man, they're just lighting things on fire and then just being happy about it. But here we're supposed to be different. And there are elements of this in Jesus, right? Aren't we supposed to forgive each other? Aren't we supposed to go to each other when there's a conflict? So a lot of this is still happening, just in different ways and maybe through different expressions. But the concept, how cool is this to keep the community together? By the time Jesus comes around, they might have not been doing a lot of this because Israel was deeply divided. I mean, horribly divided. Left, right, far left, far right. I mean, all kinds of divisions. So that's the fellowship or thus peace offering, right? Peace with God, peace with each other. The next one, sin or purification offering. The elements of this could be any of the elements of the previous three types, like the animals or the bread or whatever. Though unlike the peace offering, the meal was not to be shared. Here you're just having things burned, sacrificed, and it wasn't to be shared as a meal. So what's the purpose of the sin or purification? I mean, some of it is descriptive. The primary purpose of this was to atone or kippur, right, for unintentional sin. In other words, it's the recognition that we all struggle. We all struggle. And it was then to purify that sticky mess that we have. I used this imagery in class once. Have you ever put on Nutella on a piece of toast? You guys Nutella, y'all fans? It's sweet, it's delightful, it's creamy, and so you get it there and you put the knife way in there and then you just start spreading it and stuff, and somehow it gets on your hands. And then it's on the handle. You're like, how's that? And then, part of you trying to lick it off. I mean, depending, how germaphobe you are, or you're trying to wipe it off. And it just, then it's like on your shirt. And then later it's on your elbow. And then I go to OC. And then somehow later it's on my Bible. And I'm like, well, what's happening? Sin. It's just sticky like Nutella. I said that in class once. The next class, this student came down to me and gave me this little tiny bottle of Nutella. And she said, "You have ruined Nutella for me." I just handed that to me. So hopefully I haven't ruined for you. But so purification is you washing off the stuff that you unintentionally are getting on you because you live in this mess. Does that make sense? And so you were unclean, which is our whole next topic, next class is the unclean. So return. We'll talk more about that. But so the primary, once again, it's to atone for your unintentional sin. It's to wash off that contamination that you didn't intend to be on you, but you got on you anyway. And so that you can then continue to approach God. All right, so it's for that unintentional sacrifice. In other words, for unintentional sin. It's a sacrifice of recognition that the world is deeply broken and you and I are inevitably going to be influenced by it. And if we sit in our pews and think that we're not, oh, how naive. We are, deeply, sadly, still. Hopefully less and less, but we have, and in Jesus this continues to be true, right? We are continuously made clean because there's a need for continuously being made clean, right? So that continues on. The last one here is guilt offering. And this is interesting. So here's the practice. You can read it, Leviticus 5-7. It was an offering specially emphasizing the whole kippur thing, the whole atonement, the whole cover over, where a person could make things right by bringing a ram, it was a ram, or a sheep, a lamb to the flock, from their flock without defect, and it had to be sacrificed, and there's a whole particular way of how and why. The priest would then make that atonement for them, and they would thus be forgiven. Right? This is more the reality of we sin, and sometimes intentionally, and we just need God to keep making us right. So the purpose, just that, right? It's an offering to make reparations with one's sin. And as such, this offering had also a specific monetary value. Because this wasn't just some theoretical, I am a sinful person towards God. It is inevitably also, I am sinful in how I interact with my community. And so you would go to layers of it. You go to the priest, right? And you make that right there with God. But then if there was a need, you should work things out with your neighbor. So this isn't just, we're all sinners. It's also, we're all sinners, thus you and I suffer for it. Our relationships suffer for it. We accidentally, unintentionally, intentionally make a mess of our relationships. And so you could then go pay or repay or pay whomever you defrauded or hurt in any particular way. And then if there was a monetary part of it, you were to give 20% on top of that to the priest for having to do all the work for you. So when you hear Jesus talking about if you're at the altar and you are repairing your relationship with God, and you realize that you have sinned against your brother, you put a pause on this and you go fix that. Because this is really about you fixing this. So just to be like, oh, God and I were good. Yet whomever you hurt, defrauded, offended, and you make no efforts to repair that, you have not completed the offering. So God here is creating a particular ritual that allows you, because of your relationship with God, to repair the relationships with each other in our community. Right? We have a legal system out there that sometimes forces us to do that. Here, it's voluntary. We're supposed to make things right with each other. Now, I don't know today if you got to go, pay stuff. I mean, sometimes you take somebody out to lunch that you need to, fix a problem with, and you pay their lunch, and you try to reconcile. Well, I mean, maybe that's something similar. So maybe it's not so much the idea we not give money to each other, but the idea deeply continues, especially in the Lord's Supper, that your relationship with God has been repaired. Thus, you are to repair with each other. And the difference between here and with what Jesus has done is that here you have not yet repaired your relationship with God until something dies on that behalf. So you kind of got to weigh out a little bit in a sense like, well, I really need to repair, with my neighbor, but I haven't yet repaired it with God. So you kind of, but here's the thing with Jesus. That part's already been done. We got no excuse now. That part's been fixed. We need to go fix it with each other. Does that make sense? So now they don't sound as weird, do they? Now, of course, cutting animals and blood everywhere, that's strange. But you understand the intensity of it, the severity of it, the importance of it. If little Lammy's got to die every time you're making a mess of stuff, that would be very visceral. Today we're just like, well, people get offended, haters are going to hate, whatever. We're just so casual about it. So casual. But the significance of it continues on. The essence of it is what? If you're going to gather around this God is interested in a right relationship with you and with each other. And thus, he's not petty, he's not cruel, he's not vindictive, but relationships matter. So the whole it's me, Jesus, and a selfie does not work. I'm all about Jesus, I don't do church. Well, you're really missing what this is about. You cannot not do community. Is that enough knots? You have to do community as an expression of your relationship with God, because that's really what it is. It's a communal thing. So once again, what's the modern relevance of this, right? Besides the things we've been saying. A couple things there. One is we got to be careful not to just do the rituals for the ritual's sake. Like warming the pews. But then we do put no effort into each other. Hosea talked about this. God through Hosea said Israel already was getting themselves in this superficial relationship with God and others. He says, what can I do with you, Ephraim? What can I do with you, Judah? And it's talking about the north and the south. Your love is like the morning mist, like the early dew that disappears. Therefore, I cut you in pieces with my prophets. I kill you with the sword of my mouth. He's being figurative here. Then my judgment goes forth like the sun. For here's the heart of it. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, and acknowledgement of God rather than burnt offerings. In other words, he's not saying throw the sacrifices out. He's saying the sacrifices aren't just about sacrificing. They're not just about the ritual. It's a ritual for a particular purpose that is to have a transformative impact on community. And so Jesus quotes the same verse when he's talking to the religious leaders of the time, where he says they're criticizing him for interacting with sinners, the relational. He's being criticized for reaching out, mending relationships. And he says, to the nerdy academic religious people of his time, do you read your Bible? You should go read Hosea. And then he quotes the whole mercy, not sacrifice. What does that have to do to us? I wonder if we occasionally just do stuff because it's the stuff to do. You know you can come and should every day, every time it's open. You could sing the songs and should. You can contribute and should. And you can pray and should. You can get baptized and should. And you can do all the stuff. You can take the Lord's stuff. We can all do right, the practices of it right. But if that is not transforming you towards the purpose of what any and all of those things are about, you have just had a shallow religious experience. Some have recognized that, and their solution is, we're just going to throw all the rituals out. Yeah, that's a mistake. That's definitely not the way to go. But there are rituals, and they are important, and they are significant, they are symbolic, and they are to be transformative. So the right mechanics are not enough. They're not enough. And of course, spoiler alert, this is setting the stage for more. What this is in part doing, and needs to be repetitively done, Jesus is the fulfillment of this. This is a shadow of more, of what will be more. And this is in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 10. The law is only a shadow of the good things that are coming, not the reality themselves. For this reason, it can never, by the same sacrifice repeated endlessly after year, make perfect those who draw near to worship. It wasn't an ultimate solution. It was a temporary solution. Verse 2, otherwise, would they not have stopped being offered? For the worshipers could have been cleansed once and for all and would no longer have felt guilty for their sins. But those sacrifices are an annual reminder of sin. It is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away the sin, ultimately so. And that's, of course, Jesus. And then in Romans chapter 12, verse 1, we are to be transformed by this. And here's how Paul says it. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in the view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true, proper worship. The rituals play a role, but ultimately they are to transform your life so you live sacrificially, expressing what all this is supposed to do. And then we'll conclude with Hebrews 13, 15 through 16. Through Jesus, therefore, let us continually offer to God a sacrifice of praise, the fruit of lips that openly profess his name. and do not forget to do good and to share with others. For such sacrifice God is pleased. It is ultimately about transformed lives, transformed community as we gather around the presence of God. And ritual sacrifices and these rituals help draw us near to Jesus, or to God through Jesus. Next time, chapter 11 through 15, we're going to talk about clean and unclean. So, mold and skin disease. It'll be fun. It'll be fun. Come back. It'll be exciting. All right, let's have a prayer. Dear God, we thank you for the opportunity to gather. We thank you for the opportunity to be made right. We thank you for the opportunity to draw near. And then and now you have been gracious in creating ways for us to do that. In the ancient early parts of the story, ways that set the stage for the need for more. Ultimately, Jesus, the Lamb of God, the sacrifice, once and for all. As we continue to gather around Jesus, may we be transformed by the rituals we still do today, that we can remember the purpose and that we can be made different, better, and we can act in ways that have an impact on relationships, on community, and it can ripple through our society. Thank you for Jesus. In his holy name we pray.